bad streak of not recording this lecture. Anyway, okay, so thing number one, right, in case anybody didn't know, labs start this week and you got to show up in person to get anything like full credit. So lab exercise 1 happens this week. That's something. Number 2, there is a list of TA office hours links. So if anyone here had a Monday lab, you know, and you want to ask a TA for help, you can do that. The TA office hours links, it's a list of guest links because Blackboard Collaborate has this quirk where you can't just merge sections together, right? So in order to let any student go to any, basically I have to post this massive list of guest links. But yeah, please, you know, feel free to go to any TA office hours, whatever fits your schedule, okay? We have, if you look here, I'll zoom in a bit. Holy shit, that's big. If you look in, right, we have people every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So there's people around the middle of the day, any day you might need them. Okay? Okay. So there's that. And if you haven't joined PackBack yet, you probably ought to join PackBack. So, you know, sooner you start, the sooner you get all the points. Okay. So then we have a couple lectures. So remember, the outlook going forward, hopefully we're going to finish up the access and security lecture on Thursday. If there's a few slides left, we'll push those off till next Tuesday. But Tuesday will be mostly or all a review session ahead of the exam. So between now and Thursday, I'll post up the FAQ for the exam and the topics of interest. I'll have all the topics of things that might appear on the exam, that will appear on the exam mostly. And, you know, we'll go over that with the review session, but it'll be up if you want to, you know, start studying. Okay, so that's what's going on, right? So today, newsfeed, we'll get it, make a dent in security. Thursday, we'll hopefully finish up access and security. Thursday, or next Tuesday, will be the review. Next Thursday will be the exam. Okay, I saw a couple hands. Yeah, go ahead. Correct. Yeah, and it should be posted that way on Blackboard. So yeah, I mean, we don't expect, you know, nobody's going to do anything on a holiday. It's the point of a holiday, right? But yeah, it's due the next day. Yeah, you had a hand up. Next Thursday. You're welcome. Okay, good. Well, let's move on then. So we'll wrap up newsfeed. This is where we left off. We left off with thin versus thick, clients and applications. And so we're going to go on. Is ACID properties. Okay, so basically we talked a little bit before, we hinted about how databases, you want them set up so they only give one correct answer at any given point in time, right? There's anything you're looking for in the database, it's only going to be in one place and it's going to have the correct answer, right? That makes sense, I hope. However, well, we'll talk in a minute. It does get more complicated, but that policy of having only one thing and having it be correct and having the one thing be in the right place, all that's operationally implemented through what are called ACID properties. These are policies that you have your database follow in order to ensure that, you know, the database is correct and holds what you're looking for. And the 4 properties, one for each letter of ACID: atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. And we'll get into all those in just a moment. So we'll have a hypothetical example. Suppose you're updating your Facebook relationship status to "it's complicated." Okay, it's a database operation. So first one, atomicity. So just like atoms were once thought to be indivisible, but if you've done anything with nuclear physics, you know that's not exactly true. But once upon a time they thought they were. So that's what atomicity means here, is basically indivisibility. That if there's a bunch of related database actions, either they all happen or they don't happen. They happen as an atomic unit. So I'm going to give a practical example, screen. Suppose your profile information is stored separately on 2 machines in 2 different data centers. Okay, so when you update your relationship status, there are 2 machines that must receive the update, receive and process the update. right? That makes sense? There's 2 copies. So I'll make a note that this is for atomicity. Okay. Now, if both successfully process the update, that's great, right? Everything is correct. And remember, what we want is the database to have one correct answer in one place. So whichever copy you look at, right, if they're both showing the right answer, that's great, it's fine. However, if either fails to process the update, then the operation not be completed on either copy, right? Because if you did, you'd have one copy that had, relationship complicated. The other copy said relationship whatever it used to be. There would be a mistake, right? And the answer you got would depend on what piece of hardware you looked at. So even though, right, this isn't great, right, the user will get some failure notification. At least it's not a database problem, right? So what would happen is you try to do it, one of the machines is non-functional for whatever reason, and you'll get a thing, sorry, this operation could not be completed at this time, and both copies will remain in their original state. Okay, so that's what atomicity means. It's a pair of related database operations. You want to change the relationship status, it has to be updated on both copies. If that doesn't happen, if it only updates on one but not the other, you'll have a problem. Okay? Okay. The second one is consistency. And consistency is kind of a weird concept, but basically it means following the rules. So whatever policies your database has, for example, in Facebook, you generally have the policy that the default setting is friends can see your posts, non-friends can't. So if someone is your friend, they ought to be able to see your profile information. And if someone is not your friend, then probably they ought not to be able to see it. So the point of consistency, the way they phrase it in database talk is they say any database beginning in a consistent state has a valid operation performed on it will end up in a consistent state. Basically, just substitute consistent state for following the rules. If you have a database that starts off following the rules and you do a valid operation on it, the database should follow its own rules afterward. Okay? So, example of that. Okay, we'll do consistency now. Suppose you have unfriended someone just before you post your relationship update. Okay? That unfriend should not be able to view your profile or receive the notification about your status update, right? So what could happen though, imagine if the unfriending was not fully processed before the relationship update was processed. Okay, then the unfriend could see the status update, which presumably you don't want. Okay, so that would be an example of non-consistency. So in this case, consistency is helped by processing all database operations in order. Okay, basically each one must complete before the next one starts. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? So again, the initial consistent state is you have someone who's a friend, they can see your relationship status, you unfriend them, and then afterwards you update your relationship status. Well, if both things have gone correctly through in order, there should not be a point where your now non-friend can see your relationship update. Okay, that's consistency. But like I said, it basically just means if your database starts out following the rules and you do a valid operation on it, it should still follow the rules afterward. That's what consistency means. Okay. Now the next one, isolation. Isolation is very, very, very important. That's pretty core to ACID properties. So isolation means no database operations affect others directly. Each gets executed the same way, regardless of any other operations that are going on at the same time. In practice, what this means is each database operation is treated as an atomic unit that gets fully processed before any other part of the system or user can access any part of the database involved in that operation. Now, I'll give you, I mean, that's a lot of words. So I'm going to give you an ATM example. Okay. Suppose my wife and I have a joint checking account, and we both try to withdraw cash at the same time. Okay? So I'm going to draw me. I'm going to draw, well, I'm not really going to draw me. I'm going to draw an ATM. Okay? So this is ATM 1. And over here we have ATM 2. Okay, and this is me here, and that's her over here. Okay, so the first thing that we try to do at the same time, and assume initial balance is $1,000. Okay, that's how much money we have in our account. Initial balance, $1,000. Okay, so I start off withdrawing $500. Okay, and at approximately the same time, she does the same thing. Now, when both of these operations are done, how much money should be left in the account? Right, we should drain it, right? I'm going to show you a case where we break isolation. First, of course, what should happen, right? I'm going to do this in green because this is the should happen, how the world should be. ATM checks balance, in RAM updates, well, I would say, you know, gives me cash, updates in RAM to $500, right, the balance, and then writes that value to the database. At that point, it's permanent. And we can understand how that should happen, right? The ATM has its own, you know, whatever, has some RAM there, some application, whether it's, you know, actually on the ATM or on a server that's just echoing the results to the ATM, doesn't matter. Somewhere in RAM, there's a database application, or, you know, there's a banking application running that says, okay, I checked your balance, you have $1,000, you can cover this, I'm going to give you the money. Once I've given you the money, I'm going to update that value in RAM to show that the new total is 500. So I'm going to do the math in RAM. I'm not going to do the math on disk. And then I'm going to write that value to the database, right? I'm going to have a modify operation where I say, okay, update the balance to $500. And it's basically going to be the same over here, right? Except that, you know, instead of giving me cash, it'll give her cash. But you get the idea, right? This will be the same. Gives her cash. There we go. Okay, and then updates the database balance to $0 because that's how much is left, right? And it writes that. That's what should happen if both of these transactions are processed in a fully isolated way. That basically this whole transaction happens first, then this whole transaction happens second. Okay, and that's the way it should be when you have isolation. However, things can go horribly wrong, okay? For example, it could be ATM checks balance, fine so far, okay? But at the same time, suppose we do it at exactly the same moment, ATM checks balance, right? They both happen at the same time because they're not isolated. These two database operations, their different steps start to interleave instead of being sequential and isolated, okay? So these things happen at the same time. and it reads them both as 1,000. So far, this is okay, right? The correct value is $1,000. But what happens, the next problem, whoop, that should be green. The next problem is going to be where these happen simultaneously. Withdraw 500, and over here, withdraw 500. When these happen at the same time, the ATM, the banking application, has that $1,000 stored in RAM as the total, okay? But when each of these happen at the same time, both withdraw 500, it's starting from the beginning balance of $1,000. So then the new balance is not going to be 0 for either. New balance, 500. Same over here, new balance, 500. Now I get the money, and she gets the money. One of these two is going to complete first. Regardless, it's going to overwrite the database by saying ending balance $500. This is a problem, right? Because we took $1,000 out. The bank doesn't want to lose that. All right, so this is an example of the sort of problem that can happen when you don't have isolated database operations. And some of you may be thinking, wow, that's insane. How could a bank be so stupid to not do something to fix that? Yes. In practice, what would happen is that when either of us actually initiates a withdrawal operation that's actually going to change the database instead of just reading what's there, the system should put a lock on those rows of data and say, okay, these rows are locked. Nobody else can do anything with them until whatever operation started first is actually done. Right? So it would be maybe I put in the request to withdraw money first. My wife would see the message, sorry, this account is being used at this time. Please check again later, whatever. Or if hers went in first, then I would see that same message, right? But either way, it would ensure that the transactions were isolated. And like I said, you know, in a well-designed system, that's exactly what should happen. But not all systems are well-designed. I'm going to mention this. Okay, so we have here, this was, you guys have heard of Bitcoin, right? Yeah. This very thing, there was an exchange called Poloniex, which in 2014 had a big hack. That's one of my favorite stories because it's nice and relevant to this. So Poloniex, I'm sure they're smart guys. I'm sure they knew stuff about networks and application coding and math and all that good stuff. But clearly they weren't really database guys, or they would have seen this problem coming. Here's what happened. The hacker discovered that if you place several withdrawals all in practically the same instant, they get processed at about the same time, resulting in a negative balance, but valid insertions into the database. It's exactly what we were talking about there with the ATMs, right? They're all doing like thousands of simultaneous withdrawals. You know, yeah, once the system catches up and figures out what's going on and looks at the total of all those transactions, it's going to recognize, oh shit, you guys took out a lot more money than you had, right? But they didn't have any kind of locking mechanism in place that was going to be fast enough to deal with what those guys were doing. Anyway, so yeah, you know, in a well-designed system, isolation shouldn't be broken on something that important. They got hacked for like $20 million, but not all systems are well-designed. All right. Anyway, in practice, another way of looking at isolation is that if there's an operation in progress on some data, you can't see that intermediate state. For example, if there's two copies of the relationship update, one on one server, one on another server, until those two are synced up and they're both either showing that the change happened or they're both showing that the change was aborted, it failed for some reason, you can't look at that in the intermediate state, right? You'd either look at the initial state of the original relationship or the final state after. Yes? Yeah, it's very much like that. Yeah, and for the same reason, right? If you guys have ever bought tickets through Ticketmaster, eventually you'll get to the thing, it pops up, it gives you an offer to buy tickets, and you either have the option to pick them or throw them back, or it'll time out in like 6 minutes or something. Yeah, because it would really suck if you thought you were getting great tickets and then somebody else came along and bought them while they were in your hand, right? Yeah. So same kind of idea. If Ticketmaster broke isolation for that kind of operation, people would get super pissed, right? They'd be like, oh yeah, I was gonna buy front row tickets to see whoever, but it didn't happen because, you know, I had some network hiccup and somebody else got them. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, same kind of idea. All right. Last one, durability. Durability is pretty simple to understand. It just means that once a database operation has been processed, it's actually permanent. It stays in the database. And typically, this is achieved, you know, by number one, storing it on permanent storage media like disk instead of just RAM, and number two, storing multiple copies of it. So, I mean, obviously, it's true that, you know, if a database operation happens and some psycho goes loose at every Facebook data center and sets all the servers on fire, yeah, you're going to lose data then, right? But normal operations, durability just means, you know, barring something crazy like that, if a database operation is done, it's permanent. It's stored permanently somewhere. It can't, you know, it can't just be lost in the shuffle. Okay, so that's durability. And again, all those things together make sure that database is going to have one correct answer to any one question. Okay, which is a nice property in many cases. However, moving on, you know, we've talked about how, you know, databases have scalability problems, and what's easy to implement at a small scale often requires some additional thought and complexity at a bigger scale. So one of the problems with ACID properties is they can inhibit performance. In particular, they can make databases run really slow. So imagine if you have a large database system with some lumps of popular data, okay? Users are often gonna have to wait for operations to happen. So simple case, Facebook has like 3 billion users, right? 3 billion monthly users. And every now and then, one of them is changing their profile, right? It wouldn't surprise me if all the little tiny profile changes that happen are keeping the system pretty busy just by themselves, right? Every little bit of action that somebody does, anything has to be recorded in a database somewhere. But imagine somebody tries to do a query on Facebook to find a particular user. Well, guess what? If somebody is changing their profile information anywhere in the world, you can't run that query on the entire list of Facebook users. Why? Because that row would be locked, right? Any user goes in and they start making a change to their profile, you know, until that profile change happens, nobody can do a query. And so the more people that are doing profile changes at any moment, and other people that are doing any sort of search for people, and not just outside Facebook, it can be everything inside Facebook too. Facebook's trying to construct the feed for somebody, so they look at all your friends and what they're doing, and pulling off that feed, say, oh, we have to wait. Somebody's doing something with their profile, and we won't be able to perfectly calibrate what the results are going to be until that operation is done. So what tends to happen is you have this kind of snowballing of backlog effects, right? People try to do something that should be simple, but because there are other people, other users, internal and external, accessing that same part of the system, it slows down. And the more things that slow down, everybody's got to wait longer, because people still want to do the same amount of stuff with Facebook during the day, right? Just the fact that there's system delays doesn't mean people be, you know, until they abandon the system, it doesn't mean people are going to stop doing things, stop looking at their feed, whatever. But there's going to be a lot of backlog, and all that backlog is just going to keep on building up. So the options for dealing with that problem, and we have a couple things, you know, there's a couple examples in here. We'll talk about deadlock more. Deadlock is the case where two people are trying to complete an operation, but the database is structured in a way that both operations are keeping the other one from completing, and the system just locks up. But in many cases, Facebook chooses a policy of what's called eventual consistency. So you see that last point there. How much does it matter if one user's post on a server isn't immediately echoed everywhere? Imagine if you've posted a photo and it's stored on two different data centers on opposite sides of the world. And for a little window, right, one of them shows that 10 people have liked it local to that data center, and the other one shows that 11 people have liked it local to that data center. There is an inconsistency, right? But the damage of that inconsistency is trivial, right? It just really doesn't matter. And Facebook is going to catch up with it anyway, right? Facebook will eventually, you know, do some kind of batch update to all the photos stored at the other data center. They'll share the information back and forth. It's a lot faster to do that in batch operations than it is to launch an entirely new operation for every tiny little update for its 3 billion users. So, like I said, number one, the cost of that problem is negligible. You don't really care. It's not like somebody in, somebody in Taiwan is going to be looking at that photo and saying, oh shit, this one shows 11 likes, and I just looked at the one in California and that had 10 likes, and I want my money back, Facebook. No, it's not like at all like the Poloniex exchange hack, right? This is a case where the costs of data inconsistency are, like I said, trivial. They're not even there. So Facebook often does an option called eventual consistency, where it's like, yeah, we know it's not going to be consistent for a while, but we'll get to it. You know, typically within a few to several seconds, we will make it update, but this is something that doesn't have to be current to the millisecond, okay? Now, in general, if you have ACID property troubles, right, basically your system is not performing well or fast enough, there's a few solutions. And we're going to talk about some of them in a moment, but big picture, ACID properties make your database give correct information, but can easily make it too slow at large scale, right? So, options. Number one, give up some of the ACID properties, right? In particular, accept inaccuracies, right? Like with eventual consistency. The second thing you might do, and this is like a more advanced trick that some of the big ones like Google do. Another one is partition database tables into slices to have finer control over how much data is involved in an operation and needs to be locked. All right, so that's one of the things that I don't need to get super detailed into this, but yeah, if you can say, well, we know we're only doing this operation on these few rows, and we can ignore that. And in particular, you can combine that with number one. So for example, Google has like some massive set of web pages associated with some search terms, and it updates a few of them because the page owners actually changed the page. Well, for a little while, number one, Google could store those older copies at another data center, let people look at those, that's fine. And then Google can update just those few pages in place and not have to lock up that entire relevant database table, right? They say, yeah, we're doing something with these, but we're not going to lock up the whole system. We're just making a change on one copy of the data. Once that change is done, we'll make a change on the next copy. Once that change is done, we'll make a change on the next copy. And yeah, there'll be a little window where you might have some inconsistencies. The last one though, reducing database functionality. Okay, in particular, not allowing complex or multi-table queries. Okay, and we'll talk, the database issues are a lot simpler if you don't allow multi-table queries or only allowing read operations, not write. So for example, with Facebook's haystack system, you upload photos, but you can't edit them once they're in the system. And that means a lot of those ACID properties kind of go away, right? Once you've uploaded it and it's there in the system, I mean, you want durability, that's great. But atomicity, it doesn't matter because any copy of the photo is going to be the same one because why? It was uploaded as the same and you can't change it, so it's not going to change. You don't have to worry about atomicity. Consistency. Well, if you followed the database rules when you uploaded the thing and it never changes, ta-da, you have consistency automatically. Right? Isolation, same thing, right? You upload it once, and if you're never permitting changes to it, you don't have to worry about that case where the database operations are interleaving on the same data, right? Because why? Because you're not permitting any write operations. Nobody can change it, so isolation doesn't matter. If you have a reduced functionality database that doesn't allow all those operations, then suddenly, hey, you don't need all those ACID properties. It's a lot less stuff to check. You can make your database run a lot faster to retrieve information, okay? But again, no free lunch. The cost is you can't go there and change the data. So it's always a question of getting the right tool for the right case. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right, so let's grind out these slides and then we'll have some time to talk security. Okay, so NoSQL databases in many ways are designed, I should say, are quite often designed to break some of these ACID properties. Basically, you design them for cases where, yeah, ACID properties are great, but we're having scalability problems. We're going to use a NoSQL database to cut some of those corners and make it run better. Okay, so Facebook, like I said, they often use database models that prioritize speed over perfect accuracy. Well, NoSQL systems are quite often designed for goals like, number one, flexibility. It's easier to add or remove data fields, right? So remember, relational database, every record within a table is going to have the same set of fields, and those fields are going to be the same size. Like we've talked about, that can create problems. Again, changing the structure of the database schema, that will likewise be a big hassle in a very large system. Accommodating different data sizes or structures, right? One of the things we talked about, relational database tables, they have trouble if the data is large, but not every instance of that data is large, right? I gave the example of a photo. Imagine if a relational database had a photo field and the photo could be as big as like 20 megabytes, but most photos were a lot smaller. Well, guess what? Your database is going to hold a whole lot of empty space. You're going to pay a lot more for database hardware than you need to. And yeah, disk storage is cheap, right? Solid state drives are pretty cheap, but at Facebook scale, if you're talking like exabytes of data, that's going to add up, right? I mean, yeah, 1 terabyte, sure, but exabytes, lots of data. Okay. Last one, auto sharding. So if you have a very big table in a relational database, if it gets so big it can't be stored on one piece of hardware, that can be a big problem because suddenly operations that used to happen on that one machine in RAM speed, suddenly they have to involve interactions across machines and they get processed at network speed. So like once you hit a bump where your tables are kind of too large to be stored on one machine, you can often find that your relational database stops performing at the speed you need it to. So auto sharding is basically a way of automatically breaking up these tables to be manageable on multiple machines. And a simple case there, think about Facebook's haystack system. If all you're doing is looking up one photo or one clump of photos stored together at a time, it doesn't really matter if the entire table is stored on many different machines because you're only ever looking up one thing, right? But if it's a table where you run a massive query to read the entire table and that entire table is stored on 1,000 machines, suddenly that's a whole lot more work, right? Because you have to scan through every table on every machine. So this is why when you have a big, very large system like Stack, you might say, yeah, I'm only going to let you access this data in certain ways. I'm not going to let ordinary users do queries to like try to find every photo that a given cluster of people have looked for, because that's going to be a very long and painful search operation. Okay. Anyway, so Facebook has made a bunch of NoSQL systems over the years. Haystack for photos, Cassandra's one they used to use for inbox data. Now it's an open source thing that they've released out into the world. And they have a bunch of other ones. You don't really need to memorize them. I mean, the takeaway from this is like, yeah, Facebook uses a lot of NoSQL systems to deal with these scale problems. Basically, in a lot of different ways, they had to design their own custom database systems. I mean, obviously, you should know what Haystack is. But the other ones, yeah, don't worry about that. And Facebook hasn't completely gone away from relational databases either. For example, for managing wall posts, it uses a SQL-based platform, right? An ordinary relational database platform called MySQL. I'm going to talk for a minute about how that can work. Because you might think, well, how can that work? Well, I'm going to tell you. Screen. Okay. So first of all, wall posts are not very big. I forget the exact character cutoff, if it's 120, 150, something like that. But wall posts are not very big. right? So we have one block here, text. But what can you put on a wall post that is big? You could tack on a photo, right? Now, if you just had a photo, raw photo data, that gets us into the same problem that you don't want a relational database for that. Some photos are very big, some are very small. But if all you do is keep a link to the photo and the photo is stored in some other database, well, guess what? That link has a standard format, right? You just say, yep, here's where it is in the database, right? So in Haystack, you can find it there. Okay. The text, sure. Some text will hit the max length, others will be short, but text posts, even for all Facebook users, just aren't going to take up that much data, right? So if you say, okay, everybody on Facebook, all 3 billion users, they all make a 100 byte, face post. That's 300 billion bytes, which is less than a hard drive every day, right? And, or less than a disk, which is like 40, 50 bucks. Facebook can afford that. Okay, so they don't have to be super optimally efficient about text stuff, because text, even if it gets big, right, they've capped it at 150, it's just not going to be that data, not that big. Whereas if a photo can go up to 20 million and they have to allow 20 megabytes for everything, well, guess what? 20 megabytes, 50 of those is a gigabyte. You can store 50,000 photos on one hard drive, but Facebook is getting like upwards of 300 million, photos every day. So that's like at least 6,000 disks. It's probably a lot more. People probably are uploading more photos now. Plus, on top of that, they need to keep backups of everything, right? Triple backup, you're looking maybe around the order of 20, 30,000 disks for every day of Facebook's photo uploads, right? So they got to be more efficient with that because the damage is potentially huge. Text data, it's not going to add up to much, even if it's not super efficient. Okay. So a couple more things. We'll be done with this. All right. So key value databases or key value stores are a special kind of NoSQL system where basically every record is a lot like an independent table. So the key things, every record has a key, just like in a regular relationship database. Every table has the keys to ensure that each record is unique. Well, if the key field is unique, you can always identify which record a particular one is, and there'll only be one with that same key value. However, the value in a key value database can be literally any structure, any database structure, and it can be different for every row. So like I said, it's like you have an independent table or even a set of tables. It's like you have a database for every record. And the case where this makes sense, something like Amazon. Amazon has its cloud system that a whole bunch of different users show up and use. They do number crunching on there. And different companies will have different formats of the data they want to keep, right? Nike might have one format for invoices and supply chain data. New Balance has another. It wouldn't make sense to force those different companies into the same database schema, right? So you say to each one of them, look, you can each have a few terabytes of data, pay us a few $100 a month, whatever. You have a few terabytes of data in our system, and you can come up with whatever custom format for it you want. So because of those characteristics, number one, it's very flexible. Changing one object's definition, right? Changing one row's structure doesn't affect any of the other rows because you've already set it up that every record in that key value store can have its own unique format. Number two, it's scalable because you've kind of built in the system that different users are going to be accessing particular elements within the database, or at the very least, you're not going to be running big queries over the entire system. Because why? Because each record has a different format anyway. Speed, you can cut corners from some of those non-acid cases, right? You can make it run faster. A lot of that is because of the point 4 is by limiting the functionality of the database. So for example, table joins. A table join is when you run a query involving more than one table and you join together data from across them. Okay, so for example, on Facebook, you might have one table of users and each user has a field for a city, and you might have a table of photos and each photo record is linked to a particular user that posted it. And in a relational database, you would be able to ask it some query like, show me a list of all the photos that were posted by Facebook users who live in Chicago, right? You could do that, but Facebook doesn't let you do that. Why? Well, because in this kind of setup, like a key value store, number one, you don't know if every record has the field you're looking for. And even if it does have it, you have to comb through the whole big record to find it, or like some list of like what all is in that record. And all those lookups operations take a lot of time because the database is really big and you got to scan every record individually, right? In contrast, regular relational database, you know all those fields are there, you know where they're going to be in the row, and you've generally set it up so that whatever part of the database you're looking at, you can process that in RAM instead of, again, at network and hard drive speeds. So key value databases, limited functionality. You tend to only be able to look at a part of it, and you can't do these kind of big queries on it, but that will actually help a lot with making it run faster for those individual users. Now, where do key value pairs make the most sense? Well, number one, any objects without a standard form or structure. For example, web pages don't have a standard form, right? Some of them have a lot of text, some of them have a little, some of them have pictures and videos, maybe a lot of pictures and videos, others have none. Some are running ads, right? Some have scripts, whatever. There's all kinds of different stuff you could have on web pages. And if you built up a relational database that had every particular thing a web page could have, the records would be absurdly large, right? What you might do, you might set up a relational database for a highly constrained set of web pages that all have a standard format, like say an Amazon product page that they're all pretty much the same. Yeah, you might be able to do that, but just web pages generally, no. Likewise for Facebook user history. Some people are very active on Facebook and have been with it since like 2005. Other people have been there a lot less and are a lot less active, don't have nearly as much data. Same problem as web pages though, basically. Some of these records would be absurdly large, others would be short, but if you're doing this in a relational database, you have to allow room for the biggest Facebook user, busiest Facebook user of all, and the one that uses the most data. You have to have room for that in order to store that, but a lot of the rest of your database is just going to be empty space. We talked about issues with videos or images. Horizontal database scaling just means you have to store it on multiple pieces of hardware, multiple pieces of storage media. So again, if you have a database of videos, chances are you got so many that you're going to need to store them all on multiple machines. Again, once you start splitting that table across multiple machines, a regular relational database is probably going to be pretty slow. Same thing for images, right? It's not going to eat up data as fast, but think of a system like Haystack, you know, like 1,000 hard drives worth of data every day. Yeah, that's going to be a lot, right? Obviously, that's multiple machines. And last, systems that have unrelated data used together, which tends to circle back to not having a standard form. So for example, suppose you had some security application, looked at the log files produced by some other application, like whatever the application is doing, the security application needs to look at all that data. Well, guess what? Log files aren't going to have a standard format. You know, some applications are busier than others. You might have a lot of data or a little bit of data in that. Likewise, the application data itself is not going to have a standard format. Same thing, the application might be busy or not so busy. You might have many different applications. So yeah, that sort of situation is going to lead to not having a standard format. Okay, now market status. Relational databases versus NoSQL. So this is unfortunately a bit of an old picture. I have not found a better, more current picture with this same stuff, but I can talk about the trends. So the green bar at the bottom, okay, well, first of all, this is the value in billions of all these database services being sold. So it's not companies like Google or Facebook that are using these services internally. It's someone shows up to a database provider and says, I would like to store some data in your system. How much will it cost, right? And they add it up and it becomes that column chart. So the green bar is relational databases. And you can see, number one, it's the big chunk of database costs out there. And number two, it's growing, although growing kind of slowly. the black and blue on top, the blue is other non-relational, but the black is Hadoop and NoSQL. Hadoop we talked about, it's a big, large-scale number crunching thing. We talked about at the end of photo management. Started out as a small slice, but again, Hadoop and other NoSQL, they're getting bigger and bigger. They're dominating as far as, you know, other non-relational. And what we see happening is that, yeah, Hadoop and other NoSQL database systems, they're becoming more important because businesses are starting to generate more and more unstructured data, data that does not have a clear format. There's still a lot of structured data, right? Anytime a customer buys something, generates an invoice, that's structured data. It has a predictable form. If you're managing supply chain data and you're gathering data points in, again, in a specific format, that's going to be relational. But stuff like web pages, videos, images, anything that's not you know, strictly formatted tends to go to that top part. So what we see, number one, NoSQL, it's a small but growing fraction of the paid database market, but the paid market we see in the columns doesn't show, number one, proprietary systems that are used internally, right? Like Facebook using Haystack. Facebook's not paying Facebook for Haystack, so it's not going to show up in the chart. And open source systems. There are a number of free-to-play systems out there that, again, if they're free, they're not going to show up in the costs. So there it is. So the big trend, as big data keeps getting bigger, and it will, and it is, NoSQL systems are going to be the ones that keep getting bigger for it. But over the next few years at least, relational database systems still do look like, you know, they're the big one. And interesting, what we see, particularly in companies like Google, they're doing kind of a midway approach where they have systems on something that they call NewSQL, which is a lot like a relational database. It's relational database compatible, but it primarily relies on data being arranged in smarter ways so it can optimize operations even though it's really big. It's not a full-blown NoSQL system that stores data totally differently, but it's kind of a middle ground there. So there's some of that too. All right. Now, we got to do this security thing. The good thing is we don't have too far to go into it, so we're going to do that. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to shout them out. I hope this is all making sense. I know it's a little bit technical, but I still hope it's making sense. Okay, so the last lecture in the Facebook module, access and security. So we're going to cover up through encryption. So intro to security, we'll cover passwords, authentication, and we'll just stop just short of encryption. So first thing, security and access. All right, security and access are basically two sides of the same coin, making sure that people can access the data that's theirs and stopping the bad guys from seeing what they shouldn't see or otherwise interfering with system operation. Okay, so we have a picture. Whoop, that's not what I wanted. This is what I wanted. Okay, imagine you have a database. Okay, and somewhere there is Mr. Green. And Mr. Green should have legitimate access to a chunk of data that we'll label as green. Okay, so he should be able to see this. He and only he, because that's his data, should be able to access this. Okay? But suppose there's another guy, Mr. Red. What could Mr. Red do? Well, Mr. Red, maybe he does. Maybe he's a legitimate user to some point in this system, right? He has some data here too. It's valid for him to access that, but what's the problem? It's obviously bad if he's trying to access Mr. Green's data, right? You want to stop that. I'm going to put an X through it. It's obviously you don't want him to be able to block Mr. Green from accessing his data, right? You don't want that to happen. What else? I mean, even aside, you don't want him to be able to listen in. I'd like draw an ear or something if I could. Let's try to draw an ear. Right, so there's an ear. I don't know, there's an ear hole there. That's an ear. You don't want him to be able to listen to the data. Okay, here. These are all problems, right? So Mr. Green should be able to access his data, and he should be able to access it securely without anybody screwing with the whole process. Mr. Red ought to be able to access his own data, but should not be able to access Mr. Green's data, should not be able to interfere with Mr. Green seeing his data, and should not be able to observe Mr. Green's data in transit. Okay, so access, again, being able to see your own data. Security is preventing any of those other bad problems from happening. Okay, access is allowing the good, legitimate access. Security is preventing the bad, illegitimate access and other actions. Okay, and in systems, of course, those are both permission-based, right? You know, you log into Facebook, Facebook knows what data you can see, and they also know what data you can't see. So, basic categories of security threats: physical, personnel, and software. So physical, right, that's keeping track of the buildings where the data is stored, keeping track of the machines that the data is stored on, and all that is obviously very important. Likewise, personnel, right, the employees that you trust to make sure that everything is safe and to carry out security policies generally, that's important. And software, right? Typically for big systems, you have a lot of automated tools to help people make better decisions about, you know, so people don't have to make decisions. You have automated tools to enforce security. Now, any one of these can be a point of vulnerability. For example, if you decide you want to steal some data, well, one thing you can do is get some dynamite, blow a hole in the wall of the building, and run in, grab the device, physical devices that it's stored on, and run out the hole, right? That's one thing. Or number two, you could talk to one of the security guys. You could be like, hey, I know these guys don't appreciate you, but you know, if you take a long walk down to the vending machines and are there for like half an hour and don't ask any questions, there's a suitcase full of 50s waiting for you there. You know, maybe they take them up on that. And of course, software, right? Various ways that software can be, you know, they don't see everything. There's some software vulnerabilities that they didn't realize were there, or the program was inherently flawed, or maybe they have a patch that they haven't installed yet, or some other update they haven't installed yet, whatever. The security software might be flawed as well. Yeah, so any of those can be the point of vulnerability. And you can also span multiple vulnerabilities. And in fact, many of the most devastating attacks have done exactly that. So I'm gonna reach into my pocket, and I'm gonna pull out my target card. What's this shiny thing on the edge of my target card? A chip. What does the chip do? Basically, the chip makes sure that I have the original card when I buy something at a Target point of sale machine, right? When I actually go into a Target store and buy something, it knows this is actually the real Target card, right? This isn't just some cheap copy that somebody got the magnetic strip data off the back. Okay, that's what the chip is for. Now, Target cards didn't have those 10 years ago, but they were starting to catch on in Europe, but they were very rare here in the United States. Until Target got hit. Target got hit by one of their HVAC vendors, high heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. What Target does is that when the store is busy, they want some of these outside vendors to be able to help control the temperature of the store, right? So they don't have to send in a guy on a truck. They say, oh, look, the store is busy. I can tell everybody's in there walking around and breathing and stuff. We better crank up the AC a little bit before things get too hot. Likewise, if the store's not busy, Target says, yep, dial down the air conditioning. It doesn't need to be so cold because there aren't that many people here. So anyway, these guys had access to not only the heating and ventilation, air conditioning stuff, but also to some of Target's ongoing sales data. Because why? Because they needed that to control why the process happened. But you had a guy at the vendor who opened up an attachment in an email that he should have. The bad guys stole that guy's credentials. They got inside the system. Target fucked up all kinds of stuff in their system. They had like server passwords still listed as, you know, username, admin, password, you know, and the guys got in there and did all kinds of damage. The only good thing Target did is they did have the password data encrypted. Otherwise, the guys would have gotten everything. As it was, though, you know, they got like tens of millions of records. I forget the exact amount, they were able to basically create phony magnetic credit cards from everybody who used a Target point of sale machine during a certain interval before Target figured out what was going on. Yeah, it was a huge deal. And then Target said, okay, we got to do this chip thing. And then the same guys did the same kind of attack on Home Depot just a few months later. Anyway, but this is an IT course, so we're going to mostly focus on the software. But be aware, you know, there's other things that can go wrong. Now, we're going to take as a dogma that perfect security is impossible. Okay, this is my security postulate. So if you've taken geometry, you might have heard of a thing called the parallel postulate. It might ring a bell. The idea is if there's one point, if there's a line and a point somewhere near that line, there might be exactly one line going through that point that can be parallel. That's the parallel postulate, and it's the basis for all this Euclidean geometry that we do. But it's not really provable. In fact, you can adopt other geometric models where you say there's no lines going through that point that can be parallel. Or you could say there's an infinite number of lines going through it that can be parallel. Depending on, you know, your geometric model, you know, it can be valid or not. So anyway, the point is this is a postulate. It's not something that I'm going to attempt to rigorously prove, but I am going to use it as the starting basis for everything that we say. But it'll make sense. So basically, any usable system is going to have some means of access. We'll call the keys, right? If you have some database system that nobody else can get into, that no one can get into because there are no keys, you don't have a database, you have a rock, right? You have a nice expensive rock. So, but if the keys exist, they can be, somebody can guess the shape of the keys, the form of the keys. If you have a password, somebody could guess the password. Somebody might be able to make a copy of the password. They might, you know, look over your shoulder while you're using the key and say, oh, I see what your password is, right? They could steal them or they could co-opt them. They could use them in some unexpected format, unexpected way that the system designers didn't foresee. But the point is, if the keys exist, it is possible that in some sense the bad guys could get the real keys or a working copy of the keys. It could happen. So obvious examples, password hacking, password document theft, right? You make a paper list of all your passwords and you stick it to your monitor and somebody sees it. Computers left it unattended while logged in, right? Maybe the log out, log in process is pretty slow on your system. So when you got to use the bathroom, you walk up and out of your cubicle for a minute, and guess what? Some shifty dude from across the way, he comes over and he, you know, yeah, it happens. Now, other thing about security, no matter how much you bulk up one part of security in your system, that just means the bad guys are going to try a different way. That just means, okay, yeah, you really bulked up that front door. I'm going to use the back door. You bulk up the front door and the back door. I'm going in through a window. You bulk up the front door, the back door, and the windows. There are actually guys that when a family went on vacation, they had this massive alarm system on all the doors and windows. Dudes actually got a Sawzall, cut a big hole through the brick wall of the house to steal shit. I'm just saying, you know, there's no such thing as perfect security if the guys want it bad enough. This example, it's kind of a fun story. So there was a long holiday in Canada, right? And there was a bank that was on the ground floor of a building, like a couple floors of residential stuff above, that happened to be abandoned at the time, right? It was like they were turning it into condos or something, I don't know. But anyway, there was a long holiday, and the bad guys pretended, they set up a big tent over the top of the building, and they pretended like they were contractors going in there to do some condo prep work or something. Friday at 5 p.m., all the bank employees check out. It's a long holiday. The bad guys, you know, they drill through the ceiling, they drill through the roof, drill through the ceiling of the floor above, drill through another floor, boop. Eventually they get into the vault where all the safe deposit boxes are. Now the vault door, that's made of like 2 feet of battleship armor. You know, nobody's getting through that anytime soon. And as long as the guys have reset the password, set the combo to something other than the default like 0250 or something, as long as the bank's smart enough to do that, there's no way you're getting through the vault. And it's probably setting off an alarm anyway. But the bank hadn't done any sort of wiring in the ceiling because they didn't think, oh, who's going to come through the ceiling? How's that? But yeah, they did. And because it was a long holiday, they had like, you know, 2.5 days to pick and choose between all the, you know, going through the safe deposit box. Oh, this is nice, this is nice, this is nice too. Let's keep this, you know. And if one of the guys hadn't squealed, they probably would have gotten away from it. But, you know, they caught one of the guys and he squealed and they all went to prison for a long time. Because why? Because robbing banks is probably wrong. It's wrong in most cases. All right. Good story, though. Now, permissions. If you've used Facebook, you know that security and access are provided by some kind of permission rules, right? In the case of Facebook, predominantly, you enter in your ID, you enter your password, Facebook checks if they're going to give you access. There can also be backup questions, right? Those security questions, do you know the answer to those? Important thing to mention about those security questions, you don't actually have to include a truthful answer. So if the question says something like, what street did you grow up on first grade, and you grew up on Main Street, you don't have to enter Main Street, because people who know you might hack that. Or you say, who was your best friend in second grade? And you put in Betty, right? It's not like the system is going to say, nope, you're lying. Jennifer was actually your best friend, not Betty. So they don't know. So if you're worried about, you know, questionable people from your own life, knowing those details, by all means, make up alternate answers. And of course, on the back end, there's control over which portions of the system you have clearance to access. So for me, I'm employed at UIC. I can get into the payroll system to look at my own stuff, but obviously I can't look at any non-public data of any other employees, right? I can't see, you know, dude whose office is next to me. I can't be like, I wonder what he's paying in taxes. Yeah, I can't do that. Okay, so anyway, if the access conditions are met, then the user gets access according to his permission level. Now, Facebook also allows varying degrees of customized privacy. One of the things you can do, even though Facebook controls access on you getting into your system, you have control over whether you want to let some other people access parts of your system. For example, you can agree to let some apps, you know, peek at what's in your basically your user history to do things like at the end of the year, they make that kind of word picture of all the words you've put in, or they look at who else interacted with you over the year and they try to pull who's your bestie, who likes your pictures, you know, who likes your pictures or posts the most, whatever. So yeah, you can give some apps the ability to check that stuff. And of course, individual users can set up their own custom groups, right? You can designate particular subsets of users that you want to give access to. Anyway, the way this works as far as Facebook delivering content, any content that you have, that Facebook has its permission type in its metadata, whether it's public or whether it's just generic set of friends for all these users or some specific name set of friends for that user. When you try to get that page from Facebook, so you log into Facebook, Facebook's got to construct the feed behind the scenes to deliver to you as a web page. So the web servers look at all the things they might bundle into that feed, and then they filter out all the stuff that you can't see, that you don't have permission to see. And that's, you know, that's what's left. That's what they send you as the feed. So the web page gets automatically constructed to only contain permitted content. Likewise, if one of your friends posts something that they've specifically blocked you from seeing, well, that's going to be seen too by Facebook, and they're not going to send you the notification because you can't see it. Okay. Now, Facebook security. Primary access method is a combination of email and password that we're all very, very familiar with. Typical passwords are going to have some kind of length requirement. It's going to have to be so many characters long. It's going to have some kind of character mix requirement, you know, contain a punctuation mark and a number, and a lowercase and an uppercase letter. And you may have to periodically update it. Backup mechanisms, again, security questions, or maybe your primary phone number. Okay, and all those are designed to prevent weak password problems. So a weak password is one that's relatively easy for some outside person to guess. For example, if it's a very short password that just contains letters, right? If it's like a 2-letter password, that's going to be pretty easy to guess. Now, these days, yeah, of course, you'd get locked out, probably. But if there's a lot of people that have 2-letter passwords, guess what? You can try 2-letter passwords on all of them. You'll get some of them. Second, including complete words. Reason why you don't include complete words is the bad guys can do what's called a dictionary attack, where they just try, you know, to run single words through, you know, some list of known users of the app. Okay? And for example, even if there's only a few people in the world whose like password is say parrot, well, guess what? When they go through the dictionary attack, they're going to go through every word in the dictionary. they're going to get everybody that uses, you know, a single word, whatever words they try, they're going to eventually get them. And of course, simple, obvious sequences like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or so on. A lot of PIN codes, you know, they specifically say you can't use a quad number, you can't use, you know, 0, 0, 0, 0, for example, and you can't use 1, 2, 3, 4. You can't use 4 sequential numbers because they know that the bad guys are going to guess those a lot. Other risk factors, anything derived from personal information, anything used on other sites, any password that's infrequently or never changed. Now, this first one, right, that's the shit you see in movies a lot. And it mostly doesn't work that way now. Anybody ever see the movie Watchmen? Seen Watchmen? Yeah, I see it. Yeah. Remember that scene at the end where they got to like break into Adrian Veidt's computer and they hack his password? They're like, Ozymandias, right? Lucky guy. Yeah, and they do that shit all the time on the crime shows. They'll have some, you know, some big drug lord and he's got his, you know, oceanfront mansion. After they've shot up all the guards, they, you know, there's just like this small pristine computer set up there, and they walk over to it, and most of the time it's not password protected, right? It's ridiculous, but yeah, most of the time it's not password protected. But if it is, because I'm thinking if I'm a drug lord, I'm password protecting my computer. You know, I got stuff to hide. I don't know. But, you know, otherwise, they go in and they do some stuff like, you know, the smart guy on the team, he's like, well, his wife's name is Susie, and she was born in June 1974, and his dog is brown. So the password is ZQR321. And bing, it opened. I was like, what the fuck? No, nobody does that in real life. Anyway, things used on other sites. So I had a throwaway password that I used on a bunch of throwaway sites that I didn't care if they got hacked. You know, yeah, because I didn't want to remember a million ones. But I had used to use that for my Yahoo account, okay? And I still had a Yahoo account, but I changed the password. But one day I was lecturing on something and talking about spam, and I opened up my own spam folder in Gmail, and there was like this threatening thing in there said, you know, blah, blah, you know, we have your password, and they listed the password in the subject line. And I'm like, that's strange. That did used to be my password. Let's see what this is about. And I open it up, and they're like, well, you know, we see what you've been up to, and the cops will be very interested in knowing about it, and we're going to tell them unless you send us 10 grand in Bitcoin. And I'm thinking, I don't think the police are that interested in anything I've been doing. Maybe you got me mixed up with something. Anyway, sounded like a scam. But anyway, but they did legit get my password from the old site. So if you have a password that's used on many other sites, of course, it's going to be easier for the bad guys to steal it if one of those sites had weak security. Now, last slide. Oh, actually, sorry, I got 2 slides. So number 1, ideally your password would be a long randomized string of numbers, right, with a bunch of different characters, unrelated to prior passwords, specific to Facebook. The advantage of that is there's no way the bad guys are going to be able to just randomly guess that. The disadvantage is it's really hard to remember unless you're robot-like, right? And that creates its own set of problems. Maybe you can remember one for Facebook, maybe another one for UIC, but if you got a lot of sites like that and they require occasional updates, it's hard to remember all of them. But in general, probability of random guess gets really small really fast if you have a lot of characters and each character has a lot of possible options. So if you have one character, one letter password, but it can be 100 different characters, it's a 1% chance they're going to get it. If you have 2 characters like that, it's 1 in 10,000. 3 characters, 1 in a million, right? If you have 15 characters, it's a very minuscule probability that somebody could guess it. Okay. So basically, if you have a strong password, nobody's going to guess that, but even there, no free lunch. It's going to be hard to remember. You need some mechanism to remember that. Now, gets to this. So multi-factor authentication, you know this, 2FA, right, requires the password and quite often some code received through a text. But there could be other options, right? It gets to email or you call and talk to somebody, whatever. Now, where multi-factor authentication is useful is if some random person attempts to log into your account, they know your email, they know your password, but they don't have access to your device, right? Then they're going to fail the 2FA. UIC has this. When I try to look into my payroll information, if I'm on campus, they treat being on campus connected to the UIC network as one factor, and then I just need to provide my password. But if I'm at home, they got to send me a text, and I enter in the code. But the problem, right, remember back to this, Disadvantage, hard to remember these things. So a lot of people leave them stored in their devices. But what if your password is locally saved and some random person steals your phone, right? Yeah, that's a problem. But if you got your banking stuff and everything on there, then yeah, maybe Facebook isn't your top priority. But still, the price is you have a strong password that nobody can guess, but then you can't remember it, so you store it on your phone, which means now you have to watch your phone and make sure that's password protected, and hopefully it is. All right. Anyway, we'll come back Thursday. We'll talk about encryption, and it'll be loads of fun. Okay, we'll see you next time. Okay.
Can we ask 3 questions and then answer 2